Question 11. It is now a common complaint that the electronic media have corroded the intellectual skills required and fostered by the literary media.
This is, I know this won't make sense to the listeners, but this is sort of what we were discussing earlier off recording, Ben,
Yeah.
a little bit. But this sort of just seems is kind of giving Boomer a bit that I guess there's people are complaining that electronic media, which is kind of an umbrella term, but we can think of social media, video games, television, really any form of technology um, have negatively impacted these intellectual skills from literary media being like, traditional books or whatnot.
Yeah.
This is just presented as a complaint that people hold. This is not necessarily the author's perspective.
Yeah, it might be right. It might be wrong. But we do know
Yeah.
some people are saying that, I guess, either phones or TV are destroying the skills that reading once fostered, which might be true. It also might not be. We just don't know at this point. So they continue. But several centuries ago, the complaint was that certain intellectual skills, such as the powerful memory and extemporaneous eloquence that were intrinsic to oral culture, were being destroyed by the spread of literacy.
Okay, so a little bit of a long statement here, but essentially the author is pointing out that, you know, we've been here before in terms of this complaining about new, not technology, but new, developments in communication or whatnot, where, nowadays people complain that, okay, electronics are corroding skills from literature. But again, the author is pointing out that, well, several centuries ago, basically it was the same complaint that the intellectual skills like memory, they give examples, memory and eloquence, that were essential to oral culture, like oral storytelling, non-written cultures, non-literary cultures were being destroyed by the spread of literacy, with the rise of like the printing press or whatever, right? We don't the actual
Yeah,
context in history doesn't matter, but
which
um
also might be valid. Like that actually might have served, like that might be true. Maybe people's spoken ability did go down with books. Maybe it didn't. I don't really know. But we're basically saying this complaint is nothing new. People are always complaining about new technology. Maybe in 50 years, we'll all be complaining about the good old days of when people were intellectual and were on TikTok, as opposed to having things just like injected straight into their brain. That might be a bad reference, actually, now that I say that, with the news about TikTok potentially going away. But we'll all remember the few years of our minds being mushed by that app. Or maybe it'll say, who knows? Anyways, we continue. So what awaits us is probably a mere alteration of the human mind rather than its devolution.
Okay, so here it seems like this is the author's position based off what they've pointed out about, current complaints, past historical trends. They are arguing that instead of, as people are complaining, like, oh, there's a corrosion of these intellectual skills, people are just getting dumber, whatever it is, right? The author's suggesting that perhaps it's just a shift in our brain, the mind, the way it works, that, we've sort of perhaps evolved our way of thinking due to the spread of literacy. And now there's going to be just a shift in that due to electronic media, but it's not necessarily a negative thing or a devolution, not necessarily going backwards. It's just a change.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things I see issue with, and this does not end up being a question where we have to attack. I'm just always attacking because that's my inclination on LSAT logical reasoning. Is I'm like, well, wait a sec. What is like, how do we know it's an alteration as opposed to a devolution? Like maybe this critique was also a devolution. Maybe we were at our peak form when we all spoke to each other, and then we devolved into these reading monkeys, and now we've devolved even further into like the TikTok monkeys. So
Yeah,
like,
we're never given a standard, right, of like
yeah,
what represents the peak, intellectual capacity. Like what if it is electronic brain, like that's the peak, or yeah, what if, the illiterate cultures or history
right.
when we just had oral cultures, that was maybe the peak of human intelligence. We never get that standard.
Yeah, all we know for sure, based on this argument, is that this complaint is not new. Whether or not it's an accurate complaint or inaccurate, or whether or not there's problems via the complaint, has not been addressed. So I'm like, well, evolution, alteration, like maybe, but I'm still unsold. However, they just ask us basically like what's going on. They say the reference to the complaint of several centuries ago that powerful memory and extemporaneous eloquence were being destroyed, plays which of the following roles in the argument?
So this is that the second part of the second sentence. And these are the examples of the skills, the intellectual skills held from the oral cultures. So how does this figure in the argument? I would describe this as it's sort of emphasizing the example that they're comparing the current complaint with to demonstrate that it's just a change. I would just, it really is just a premise ultimately, but they know that we know it's a premise. So they're likely going to get more specific with the answer choice.
Yeah, I would say it's like, I mean, kind of the we've been there before is often a decent way to go about it.
Mhm.
I mean, they can give it to us in a lot of different ways, but
Yeah.
it can be something along the lines like, hey, this is an example of a past scenario where we had analogous critique, or I guess another technological development that did not lead to such a bad outcome, which I didn't agree with, but that's what our author thought. And we're being asked what our author is doing here. So even though I have my pause, like, does that really prove that we haven't been here before? Our author thinks
Yeah.
so.
But yeah, in this question, this is one of the rare, I would say like this, a main point. There's a couple questions where they ask, like when they ask something like this, it then becomes irrelevant, like what we think about it. But you're right that most of the time, of course, most of the questions that we ask or that we are asked are asking us to attack. So that really should be the default setting.
Yeah. So I would say, I mean, these ones, some answers are more predictable than others. I'd say this one's like kind of medium predictable. We're probably not going to paraphrase it exactly what they say, but we can still take a moment to think about what the answer kind of could be. And I would
Mhm.
say like the answer is going to look something along the lines of an analogous situation. If I can spell analogous, right? I think that's analogous situation that did not have the, I'd say, negative consequences that we,
Feared that or that are
yeah,
assumed to have had or something.
yeah,
Or
exactly.
that we fear. Yeah.
So, starting with A, is it evidence supporting the claim that the intellectual skills fostered by the literary media are being destroyed by the electronic media?
Well, no, because that's not our claim, is it? The claim that intellectual skills fostered by literary media are being destroyed by the electronic media. That's a that claim they're referring to is the statement in the first sentence, um, and that's not even the author's claim. The author's claiming that no, our brain, our minds are just sort of changing; they're not getting worse.
Yeah.
Um,
And then further, we're talking about the shift from oral to literary in this part of our argument. Like, oh, when we stop talking to each other, here's what we lost. And this is going back to our initial idea of like, oh, the TikTokification, the TV, Instagram, whatever. So it is completely shifting around the pieces. And yeah, there's multiple reasons why it's wrong, but it's definitely
I sometimes call answers like this. My own term for this is what I call like a Franken answer. Like they're taking parts of the argument and expressing them in a way that can sound appealing because it's like, oh, they talked about this, but it doesn't work. It's not actually what this statement that they're asking about is supporting. It's they're just mix and matching the pieces to make us confused.
yeah. So we're, or we got rid of A. Let's see what B has. An illustration of the general hypothesis being advanced that intellectual. Well, I mean, I would probably already stop there, but let's read on. That intellectual abilities are inseparable from the means by which people communicate.
Yeah, and there's again several things wrong with this. I mean, and even where you stop, but even if we keep going, when they say intellectual abilities are inseparable from the means, that's just not. They don't say this at all. That our abilities are inseparable from our communication means of communication. That's just false.
Yeah,
Um,
it's like, I mean, I stopped after advanced because I was like, well, first off, this is not an example of our claim is that this is alteration as opposed to devolution. And it's like, is
yeah,
this really an
this is not an
example?
example of that. It's sort
But
of
then yeah, even if it were, that word inseparable, we just never say that. So it's like, where's that coming from? Like, this is completely new information. So ironically, I stopped before the really good reason to get rid of this even appeared, which like that word inseparable is just a death sentence. So it's like, that's new. We can't pick that. Already, what about C? An example of a cultural change that did not necessarily have a detrimental effect on the human mind overall.
okay. I mean, this is actually pretty close to what we said. It's an example of they don't say like it's analogous, but it's still, I mean, an example is or an analogy is essentially an example by comparison. An example of a cultural change that did not have a detrimental effect, that did not have the negative, we said would not have the negative consequences that we fear, not have a detrimental effect on the human mind overall.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't
it
really have
feels
any
pretty
major
close.
issues with this.
Because yeah, the change, I mean, I was like, when they go abstract, to think back, like, what is this? So the cultural change would be the shift from oral to
Hmm.
literary. The detrimental effect would be the devolution of the human mind, which, for what it's worth, I was unsold on. But for our authors' purposes, they have accepted there was no devolution. So I'm like, yeah, that fits pretty close. Always got to read all five because you never know when you're being a goober. But I'd be surprised if there's something better than C. Which brings us to D. Evidence that the claim that the intellectual skills required and fostered by the literary media are being lost is unwarranted.
This is an interesting answer, but my problem with this is that's not really the author's claim that the intellectual skills required and fostered by literary media are being lost is
Yeah,
unwarranted. They're just saying that there's like a shift
right. Well, I think
in our
you're
skills.
hitting a good point, which is that our author never says that skills aren't being lost. Maybe skills are being lost. They're just saying that's not,
Yeah, it's just
we're
it's
not
saying that
devolving.
like it is a complaint. Some people think this, but the author doesn't necessarily agree or endorse that.
Yeah, but then even if our author's like, yeah, you are maybe losing the skill of like writing or really close reading, our author's saying that's not a problem because that's just altering the mind. Like, who cares if we can't read as well? And now we're gaining other skills. Like, we never say that we actually are as good as reading. We're just saying the mind is being altered, and hence
Yeah.
it kind of is being lost. And then further, that's a good point that you were hitting, which is that's not what our author says. When we say evidence to claim that, and then this follows, this needs to be something we said. And if we don't say that intellectual skills required and fostered are being lost is unwarranted, then we can't have evidence for it because this claim was never made.
Yeah, I think that points out an issue I sometimes see with these questions when I'm working with students is that people will correctly understand like the way the part they're asking about functions, that it is going to support something or whatnot. But the problem is the entire answer has to work. So even if the answer is correctly describing, like D starts off the first sentence of D is, or first word of D, I should say, evidence that the claim. I mean, our part is evidence for a claim, but it has to be
Yeah.
the correct claim. So we have to make sure we're, of course, understanding and reading the whole answer and that the entirety of it is correct.
Right. And then E says possible evidence mentioned and then dismissed, which like I'll
Right
pause there.
away, I'm like, no,
Um,
they don't dismiss this, do they?
yeah, we just, if anything, we use it to then launch off and say, therefore, this is alteration as opposed to devolution.
Yeah,
That we're dismissed. Like, we don't do that. And
yeah,
I mean, this is one of the things that high scorers do is that we're not analyzing E super in depth. When I see dismiss, I'm like, no.
yep, it's out.
Sometimes I think we almost give a false impression as to how much thought is really going into all these answers. We like really talk through them. Like it is, we are getting rid of these often in legitimately 1 second or like
Yeah,
3 seconds. Like this is not a long process. We're doing it for your guys' sake when we talk through them. Um, we're not giving it this much thought when we're doing them because we just see it's like, okay, that's enough for it to be wrong. We're done. And the recording just does not want to stop.